Welcome back to TNT and our continued series on trauma with my good friend Debbie Piper here. The two of us will be talking mainly from our experience with trauma and also from our avid reading experience and research on the medical aspects of trauma and the different types of trauma. So we did talk some about the little t and the big T. Debbie, I know that not all trauma is what happened to us or what was done to us.
Right, right. And so that's another way we can look at trauma and just kind of finding buckets to put our understanding of trauma into. And this one is called the A and B types of trauma.
Mm-hmm.
So with A trauma, that refers to the absence of the nurturing developmental experiences and environments that we need in order to develop secure attachment, to believe that there's such a thing as unconditional love, to believe that there's healing and someone that cares about our pain, to believe that we can grow and that we can make a difference in someone else's life.
Right.
And some of us really didn't have that experience. And for myself, I know that my family situation was one where I was not a welcome surprise. I was not a desired, longed for child.
Right.
And so my parents were very ill-equipped to be able to provide a nurturing environment.
Right.
Before we get into these, I realize I should also mention then what the B trauma is.
Right.
So the B trauma type of trauma would be experiences that should never happen to anyone ever for any reason. Can I make that stronger? I don't think so. I think but I have been through some of those. And because when we don't have the capacity to provide the nurturing environment, oftentimes then if we ourselves don't deal with opening up the wounds that we have and allowing healing to begin to take place, we can just recycle the trauma.
Yeah.
And we can inflict trauma on others.
Yes, that cycle of trauma perpetuates itself from a lack of healing. It's like an infection that's, spreads to everybody else or other parts of the body. We've talked about healing, and I can tell you this, that I never really saw value in going to a counselor because I thought, why do I need to sit with a stranger and talk about my life?
Yeah, very common viewpoint, actually.
Yes, yes. However, going back to our discussion about digging into a wound and going to its deepest, most infected part, that's a very, very difficult and dangerous process. I mean, think about it. If you have an infected stab wound, you're not just going to take a little Q-tip and start playing with it and try to open it. You've got to go with someone who knows what lies below the surface of that wound.
Right.
Or at least to deal with it as you start opening it out. What do you do with the stuff that comes out? How do you, prevent further infection from forming? So if you don't do things the right way. So when you do go to a counselor, it's not an easy process. I don't remember ever coming out of seeing a counselor feeling lighthearted and, oh, this is wonderful. I'm usually torn to pieces from it because you relive the trauma. It's not a pleasant experience. You relive it. You bring out all the gunk that you've been trying to stuff down deep within. However, you're doing it with someone who specializes in how to encourage you to do this safely. And they know how to guide you and lead you through this process of reliving your experience. They know when to stop at a certain point and segue into something that's slightly different because maybe you're not at a place to really relive the full extent of your trauma. So there is a therapeutic value to going to see a professional and have this conversation that goes far beyond just you and me just talking about.
Oh, yeah.
Even though that is extremely therapeutic and extremely talking to a friend, is just, you don't feel alone. But in terms of dealing with the trauma itself, there's a process called EMDR, which really focuses on doing something similar to what we just talked about, where you talk to a counselor. However, it's refiling these memories in your brain. Because we talked about triggers.
Right.
How something triggers and takes you back to the moment of trauma.
Yeah.
That's because it's been filed in your brain in a place that you can't control. And so when you decide to bring this out consciously, you have the ability to then refile it and reassociate memories, emotions with this trauma. So if you are in a place of intense trauma, I strongly recommend you speak to a counselor or look up EMDR.
That's really interesting. I was thinking about as a child, I internalized a lot of messages about myself. And they were negative messages. And so there was a time when I was with a counselor and I was really beating myself up verbally, and which was just simply an expression of deeply held thoughts and emotions. That I was not a good wife, that I was a failure, that I would never be able to get past this, that I was going to relive examples I'd seen in my life. And my counselor had the wisdom to say, so actually to ask, because good counselors ask a lot, to ask, what examples did you have of what a good wife is? And it just stopped me. And I thought for a moment, kind of rapidly searching. And although now I would say, oh, well, my neighbor across the street, who was my best friend's mother. But in the moment, I searched my family. I said, none. And she said, so why are you holding yourself to a standard that you've never been consciously taught, formally taught, or seen modeled before you? And so I love with a counselor that they can put together pieces and they know where to go looking for the source of what you're currently experiencing. Okay, so a fun story about our chiropractor, because we have the same chiropractor. So I was dealing with some pain in my foot, some plantar fasciitis, and he had tried treating it. And at one point I said to him, so is that connected to another part of the body? I mean, I know the body's all interconnected, right? Is that connected to something else that might be influencing that? And he said, oh, well, yeah. And he went up and found this huge golf ball size, not in my calf muscle, but in the moment, he had just started dealing with where I told him the pain was. But the pain was coming from a different place. And so once we realized that the surface treatment wasn't working, then he could go deeper and look
for the root cause.
And so even though intellectually I knew everything's connected, it had not occurred to me that it could be coming from somewhere else. So a professional can be so important.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And so in providing, it was interesting when you talked about talking with a friend, and I know the value both of us have gotten from talking with one another, that can be so helpful and give us the present real-time experience of supporting, loving people and relationships and environments that can then build our courage and our belief in ourselves that we are worthy of being listened to. We are worthy of finding the healing and the hope that God wants to give us and has for us. And so then that can give us the courage to begin dealing with those bad experiences and allowing them to come to the surface. Because especially as children, we do a really good job of pushing them aside, especially if they're inflicted by our caregivers. we tend to think we are the ones who did something bad.
Yeah, and what happens with ongoing trauma, something that is repetitive, you find yourself speaking about childhood trauma, you're in a situation where maybe you're living in an abusive household and you have no out.
Right.
So how do you deal with this ongoing trauma? And sometimes it'll last for years, for decades, because you're not old enough to step out of the sphere of the influence of that abuse or violence that occurs in the home. You just learn coping skills. You learn to cope with what's been given to you every day. And you know that whatever you did today may or may not work tomorrow. So then you develop new skills. It's survival. You walk on eggshells, really, as they talk about it. You learn survival skills. As much as I hate for anyone to go through traumatic experience, to live in a domestic violence situation, to live in a household where there's parental abuse or alcoholism or other forms of trauma, I will say that this is where I feel like you'll learn survival skills you would not have learned otherwise. And they do come in handy in difficult situations because you've been there when it happens again. If it happens again, you know how to respond. In an ideal world, though, we all want to be in a loving environment, raised with loving parents, loved by loving spouses, and just have good family, good friends, and everything be absolutely healthy and perfect and nurturing. And the reality is, almost every single one of us, down to the last man, will say we've had at least one experience in our lives that has proven to be less than desirable and has proven to be traumatic to whatever degree. The trauma also comes in degrees, and not all traumas are equal. And yet, your trauma, no matter how little it might be, is very significant to you, your existence, your life. So I think it's incumbent upon us to not minimize somebody's trauma and yet not enable that person to stay in that situation, but help them to move forward, move past their experience through the process of healing. It's a process. It's not a switch. I'm healed, I'm unhealed, I'm healed, I'm unhealed. It's not how it works.
Right.
So you walk with them. If you're a friend or family member, you walk with them in this journey. And therefore, you need to understand how it works. You need to encourage them to seek specialists, and you allow them to talk about the trauma. It's a huge blessing being able to talk about trauma. Talk about what you've gone through. Talk about, even though the other person may or may not fully get it, you have the opportunity to enunciate and talk. It's empowering to just be able to talk about what was done to you. And then if you're surrounded by the right people and the right environment, you can heal. There is hope to heal from trauma. And whatever doesn't heal, it's just going to be a beautiful scar. It's going to be a beautiful scar that holds a beautiful heart together. And all the pieces held together with scars may not be perfect, but it's held together, and there are lessons learned with having paid a dear price. So do not lose the value of a scarred heart held together, because you paid a dear price for it. Use it. Use it to move forward and to do great things in life. Use it to help others be victorious over whatever the trauma that has been inflicted or has occurred to them inadvertently. I think we've talked a mouthful on trauma on this subject as well. So we will now
take a break.
Take a break from this one. We will say goodbye to you for the moment. We thank you for joining us, and we ask you to join us for the next video, where we will talk more about different character traits and terms used when we talk about trauma. Thank you very much, and we'll see you at the next video.